Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special bonus episode of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. And joining us for this bonus episode is Clare Sudbery. Hi, Clare. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Clare is joining us from, a sunny Manchester today.
Not very sunny, but...
Not very sunny. Okay, so a normal Manchester, I should
Yes.
And Clare is a lead engineer at Made Tech, a self-described math geek, an extreme programming enthusiast, and also a podcaster. She hosts the Making Tech Better podcast, where she interviews people about how to improve their software delivery. So welcome, Clare. And let's start with the, let's call it the state of the art question. The title of this episode refers to the importance of having technical focus in the Agile Coach and Scrum Master role. So let's break it down for our listeners first. What exactly do you mean when you talk about technical focus?
Okay, that's a very good question, because what I don't expect is that Scrum Masters will be highly proficient software engineers. Obviously, that's the whole point of having a cross-functional team, that you hire software engineers and those are the people who have those deep skills. But what is important is for you to understand the issues that software engineers face and to have some understanding of what technical excellence looks like and what you can do to facilitate technical excellence so that those software engineers are being given the best possible environment to produce high quality products.
So when you understand what you can do to facilitate software development excellence, what do you mean in practice? What is software development excellence in this context, and what is it that we need to understand?
Fantastic question. Yeah, okay. So I think for me, there are some basic tenets that I always look for in software development. And I suppose probably the one that is most important to understand from a non-technical standpoint is the business of continuous integration. When I say continuous integration and also continuous deployment, what I mean in a nutshell is getting your software in front of your users as fast as possible. So you want the time between the software engineering writing the code and the user using the product to be as short as possible. And that's really, really important. And, you know, I'm sure these aren't going to be new concepts to people, but I'm going to reiterate it for the purposes of my point, that the thing that I'm really interested in is fast feedback. So I want to know what our users think of the things that we're building. And I want to know whether what we've built is what they want and what they need. And I'm very aware that there are lots of things that can get in the way of that, between first asking somebody to do something and then putting in front of the users. So for instance, users might have had a very clear idea of what they wanted, but they might have failed to communicate that effectively. Or they might have had a very clear idea of what they wanted and then changed their mind. They might find that once it's in front of them, that actually their process is not what they thought it were, or this doesn't serve their process in the way that they wanted it to, and actually they have other ideas for how things might be done. And then, of course, there are all of the technical things that are constantly changing, all of the issues to do with deployment and integration, third-party tools, lots of things that keep changing that might have an impact on what actually ends up in front of the users. So the shorter that cycle is, the better. So given that basic truth that we want to get things in front of our users quickly, there are lots of things that can facilitate that about how the software engineers do their jobs. So, for instance, one of the things that I'm very interested in is something called trunk-based development. And trunk-based development is where you only have one branch of your code. So anybody who's worked in software teams will probably be aware of the concept of branches. So you might have your main branch, which is the one that is being deployed to live, and that is the thing, effectively the thing that ends up in front of the users. But you might also have feature branches where software engineers are developing new features. And personally, I would rather that you didn't use feature branches. Now, that is quite controversial, and I will qualify it. But there's a reason for that. And understanding why that is something that people who aren't software engineers can understand and can be involved in conversations about. And the reason I'm not keen on feature branches, and I have jumped in right at the deep end here, but the reason I'm not keen on them is because if you have a feature branch, at some point you're going to have to merge it back into the main branch. And when that happens, there's nearly always pain. So you may well have heard of the idea of merge hell. And this is when you're trying to merge your separate code, which up until now has had a separate existence, back into the main product. And there are always problems with that. And it becomes particularly difficult if you have several feature branches all in existence in parallel, because then they all have to merge with each other as well as with the main branch. And typically you'll end up with a race, that who can get in there first because they'll have the least pain. But the problem with all of that is, first of all, it makes things take longer. And going back to my original principle, I want to get things in front of the user as quickly as possible. It also, and the reason it takes longer is partly because merging can take time, but also because issues may arise in the process of merging, new bugs may appear, you have to test again the merged code, and then you have to fix those bugs. And all of that is delaying you getting in front of the user. And it's also increasing risk. So you're more likely to have problems.
So you talked about continuous integration and the trunk-based development. And
yes,
as far as I can translate this in my mind, these are examples of how the practices of software development can speed up the feedback or decrease the risk that we run. So as far as I understand, and maybe to correct me if I'm wrong here, as far as I understand, what you are advocating for is for Scrum Masters and Agile Coaches to fundamentally understand the process that software engineers and testers go through in order to get the product or the code or the functionality delivered to someone outside the team. Could be another team, could be a user. And so as far as I understand, this is about us being able to bring the perspective of fast feedback and high quality, less risk into the discussion of how we actually do the things that we need to do on a daily basis, right? Am I understanding correctly?
Yes, you are. But I'm really glad you asked that question, because as I was speaking, I was thinking something that I really want to get to is the tricky part of whenever non-technical personnel start to get involved in technical issues and start to understand technical issues better. It can be tempting. For instance, somebody listening to this podcast might go back to their teams and say, Clare Sudbery says that we should all be using trunk-based development, and that's what you should start doing right now. And if you do that, you're going to get some quite disgruntled people, because apart from anything else, trunk-based development is it's a bit Marmite, as we say in Britain. Marmite being this spread that people either love or hate. And some people really aren't keen on the idea of trunk-based development. And if you go to a software team and tell them you think that's what they should do, you might really annoy them. Because they might say, hey, come on, we're the experts here and we don't like it. And they will have good reasons for not liking it. And trunk-based development requires a whole bunch of surrounding skills, and it takes time to learn. And it's one tool in the software engineer's toolbox. So what's important is not that Scrum Masters start to get opinionated about this stuff, I think, because it's always important to recognize that the software engineers are the people who are closest to the metal and have the expertise, but to understand what the issues are. And so for instance, I think what's really important from your perspective is to be able to ask the question, are we doing everything we can to get our software in front of our users as quickly as possible? Do we understand why that's important? And are we constantly thinking about ways that we can reduce that feedback loop? And not only thinking about can we improve that, but also thinking about, is there anything we're doing that's taking us away from that? And so particularly when you're looking at the processes that your team are engaging in, are they allowing you to get your software in front of your users, or are they slowing that down? Are they making it harder? And it's very easy to forget that ultimately this is what you're trying to do. You're trying to get stuff in front of the users. You're trying to get their feedback, and you're trying to use their feedback to improve your processes and your product. I think that it's really important to understand that you can even have an opinion, but it's more about being informed about what the issues are rather than being opinionated about how things should be done. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think I should ask the next question, which is, okay, so let's assume that we all agree in this. Right. Let's assume that we do need to be informed on those issues, that we need to know enough in order to be able to ask the right questions. Okay, I would like to understand, what if we're not? Like, in your experience, what are the most important consequences when Scrum Masters either ignore or really don't pay much attention to the technical issues at hand?
Yeah. So I think that what happens then is that you end up with, so one of the things that can happen is that the technical staff are suggesting changes to process and are maybe trying to explain why things might be taking a long time. And it's falling on deaf ears because the people that they're talking to not only don't understand, but maybe even don't appear to be interested in trying to understand. So there can sometimes be an attitude of, well, that's not my job. I just want this to happen and I don't care how it happens. And when you're faced with that attitude as an engineer or as a supporting technical staff, then it can be extremely frustrating, because it can feel as though you're shouting into a void, and it can feel as though people are treating you as a machine rather than a human being. And particularly what happens a lot in software is that a lot of the practices that would increase quality and would actually increase speed are not happening. And the reason that they're not happening is because there is this constant pressure of deadlines. And ironically, I started talking about speed, but applied wrongly, the concept of speed can become a blocker. So if somebody's saying to you, we have to meet this deadline and this is the most important thing, or, often the idea of the sprint can become negative. So the idea that another sprint is coming to an end, we made promises about what we would deliver in this sprint, we must stick to those promises, and quite often there's a rush at the end of the sprint to just get something ready for a showcase, for instance, and suddenly quality goes out the window. So that tech debt we were worried about, forget about it. Those tests we were going to write, forget about them. And
do I understand that you're introducing this other thread, which is related to technical practices being, one of the building blocks of quality over time?
Absolutely, yeah. And if the people that you're talking to don't understand why, for instance, it's important to write tests, and why a lot of people would prefer to write that. I mean, I personally would prefer to write the tests first, but that feels slow. And at first it is slow. And if you're just focused on that showcase at the end of the sprint, if you're just focused on that deadline, then it's very easy to say, oh, well, never mind, we won't worry about that, because we've decided that the most important thing is this deadline that we've created for ourselves. And if you don't understand why it is that tests are so important, and also why it is that in order to make space for those good practices, you have to give people time and space. If you don't understand those constraints, then you might not even notice that quality is falling by the wayside because everybody's in such a panic about reaching a deadline. But if you understand why it is that tests need to be written, why it is that teams need Slack, why you have to build Slack into a system, then you will have more sympathy to the idea that sometimes deadlines can be negative.
It's funny that you just mentioned that, because here we are talking about technical practices and how important it is to have some understanding of it so that we can help teams. And then you introduce a concept of Slack, which is obviously not a technical practice, but Scrum Masters might already be aware of, right? So I think that we are also talking a little bit about the interplay of how technical practices play with process practices or communication and collaboration practices. I'm reminded, of course, of pair programming as a great collaboration tool, but when people talk about it, they can only see two developers on one keyboard, and they don't see that there's actually two brains working on the same problem. So I had another question already prepared, which was, okay, so what alternative do we have? But maybe I want to divert a little bit the conversation into, we already know what the alternative is, and the alternative is in the origins of Agile, because Agile was created, let's be very clear about it, in the software world. Agile is not a process world invention. It is an engineering, how do you call it? The pressure of delivery need invention, right? It was invented by consultants who were trying to deliver software of high quality in predictable timelines and so on. So I wanted to go a little bit more into this XP, extreme programming, and tell us what, I mean, you have obviously, you call yourself an XP enthusiast, so extreme programming enthusiast. So obviously you have a lot of background there. So why should Scrum Masters pay attention to extreme programming, Claire?
Oh, well, I mean, that is a fantastic question. And for me, to be clear, I think the main components of extreme programming are test-driven development, pair programming, and continuous integration. And all of those things are designed to increase the feedback loop, which I've already spoken to, or tighten the feedback loop, and to improve quality. So to make sure that what you're delivering is going to be as bug-free as possible, and is going to require as little change as possible. And so, and in a nutshell, that's why those processes are important. And if Scrum Masters can understand really what those processes are about, or what those techniques are about, then they're in a much better position to enhance all of the things that they probably do already understand. So like you talked about, building Slack into the system, tightening the feedback loop, you already understand what these things are. So it's understanding how those technical practices feed into that. So for instance, test-driven development is a really good one, because, and it is a whole team endeavor, and it is something that is often almost a battle that has to be won, because I suppose you can broadly split software engineers into three categories. There are those that don't, or maybe even more, but there are those that have never even heard of test-driven development. They're probably relatively few, but they definitely exist. There are those that have heard of it but don't like it. There are those that have heard of it and like it, but have not managed to persuade their teams to do it, or don't feel confident to do it, or don't feel like they have the time to do it. And then finally, there are those that have heard of it, that like it, and that do it. And unfortunately, that last group of people is not as ubiquitous as you would think. And there are lots of pressures that get in the way. And often the biggest hurdle is that people simply aren't being given the opportunity to learn how to do it effectively, because it is seen as slow. And particularly if you have a team that is not in the flow of regularly using test-driven development, then when they start to use it, it absolutely will slow them down. And because everybody's always in a hurry, it's very difficult to say, hang on a minute, let's slow down, let's learn this new technique, let's learn its benefits, let's demonstrate its benefits. But also, probably the most important thing of all is to say it is okay to move slowly. And that, when you get that into your head, then it gets a lot easier. So, and that's very similar concept to the idea of building Slack into the system. So when you deliberately build Slack into the system, you deliberately aim to have people who are effectively idle, that there will always be people who don't have something that they immediately need to do. That's what Slack really means. Then that means you have people available to swarm. You have people available to fix issues. And often counterintuitively, it means you're less likely to have bottlenecks. Well, the same thing applies to moving slowly. Because if you think about it, software engineers are people who are using their brains quite intensively to do the work that they're doing. And if they're always in a rush, then what they're not doing is stopping and thinking about what they're doing. And it's quite amazing, but still very true, that software engineers are always under pressure to move faster, which means that they are being asked not to stop and think. So the idea that you might step away from your keyboard and go for a walk, so that pair programming might involve not only having two people doing apparently one person's job, which is the first sticking point for people who hold the purse strings. They think, well, I'm paying two salaries and I'm only getting one piece of work. If you then suggest to them that those two people might step away from their keyboard, so now that's two people who aren't even working because they've gone somewhere else to have a walk and a conversation. If you think that the delivery of software is purely about somebody furiously tapping away at a keyboard, then you are totally missing the point. That high quality software comes from people who are able to take a step back, move slowly, and think about what they're doing. And that does mean if you're focused on your sprint, if you're focused on your velocity, that looks like low velocity. And if velocity is the only measure you're using to define success, then you've already got big problems, because velocity is not the only thing. And if you focus on velocity and sacrifice everything else, then what you end up with is a low quality product that's hard to maintain.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I'm sure for many of our listeners.
So, and it's really interesting. There's a guy called Keith Braithwaite in the UK who gets quite impatient when he hears people saying, but there's no time. So when we talk about pair programming, yes, but that will slow us down. When we talk about test-driven development, that will slow us down. We don't have time. He gets quite impatient and he says, but you as software engineers should be able to say to your stakeholders, we know what we are doing. We are the ones who have the expertise and we need space. We are using our brains to do this job, and we need space to allow those brains to function.
And that's something that we can help as Scrum Masters.
Exactly.
Not necessarily by going and saying we need space, but actually by, for example, implicitly giving permission to our teams to add maybe at the start unit tests, continuous integration, and then later on pair programming, test first, and other technical practices that we might want to put in place, like trunk-based development, for example.
Yes.
Let's talk about, for us as Scrum Masters, I think we need to start looking at, okay, so I understand now after hearing Claire that my job is to understand at least some part of what I need or what software engineers need in order to do a good job, right? So I'm not going to be an expert in sorting algorithms or AI algorithms. I'm going to be an expert in how we work as a team because I'm a Scrum Master, right? And technical practices will be part of that, just like project management practices, collaboration, communication practices are part of that as well. So if you would have to, if you could point us to a resource, to be a book, a blog, a podcast, or even several resources that we should be looking at as Scrum Masters in order to improve our ability to deliver on helping the teams, including in their technical focus aspects.
Yeah.
Where could we start?
Yeah. Now, this is not an easy question for me to answer because I'm not a Scrum Master. So, I'm used to accessing materials that are aimed at software engineers. So I'm not an expert on what is out there, and I'm sure there is a lot out there. What I do know is the podcast that I host. So inevitably, this is going to end up being a plug for my podcast, but we do deliberately aim our content at both technical and non-technical audiences. So if you look back at the Making Tech Better episodes, we cover lots of different topics, but we deliberately don't assume that our audience will be made up of engineers. So that is one good place to look. And we actually have a lot of more technical content coming up. Up to now, our content has been less technical, but we have content coming up on test-driven development, on refactoring, and on testing and why testing is important, what even is a test. So if you keep an eye out on our podcast, that's probably a good place to start. And then because we bring in, for every episode, like yourself, we bring in an expert in the industry. So, you know, what you can then do also is learn who those experts are and get a feel for whether their content might also be useful to you. And I think that, and obviously everybody's different, but I think that podcasts in general are actually quite good places to look in certain communities, because they do tend to cover things at that higher level so that you don't have to get into deep technical detail. Obviously, the problem is if you were to pick up a book on test-driven development, like the classic Growing Object-Oriented Software by Tests, the Goose book it's often known as, that's probably not going to be very accessible to a Scrum Master unless they also have some coding experience. So a lot of those materials are aimed at engineers, whereas when you look at people who have the kind of more magazine style format of the podcasts, then they may be a bit more likely to have content that crosses for both technical and non-technical audiences and is a bit more accessible. So I know Esther Derby does a podcast as well, which is quite good. And I'm not sure what resources Mary Poppendick has out there, but I'm thinking of Mary Poppendick because I was we were on a panel together at XP 2021, and she is particularly banging the drum for the Agile community to have more technical knowledge and understanding. She was actually the panel that we were on, XP 2021. Afterwards, we were given the attendee list, and next to everybody's, I'm not sure if we've got names actually, but we got roles, so we could see the roles of all the people that attended, and the vast majority of them were non-technical. In fact, I think the vast majority of people, not XP, sorry, that must have been confusing. I've just been saying XP 2021 because that conference was just before Agile 2021, which is what I meant to say. So the conference I'm talking about was Agile 2021. And the people who attended our panel and who attended the conference in general were mostly non-technical. So yeah, that was a long way of saying that I know that Mary is particularly interested in this. So she may also have resources that can help.
And we have had Mary on the podcast as well. And I totally agree with you. She has all of her presentations online. I'll put the link on the show notes for people to go and check them out. And yeah, I totally agree that she does bang the drum on understanding better the technical concerns that we need to, and our teams need to live with.
Another person that I would recommend actually is Dan North, because Dan North is an engineer by trade. Also Kevlin Henney, both of those, they're engineers by trade, but they do talk, and they talk about technical content, but they do it in quite an accessible way. So they are good people to look out for, because they're also consultants and they also work more generally as well as focusing purely in on the technical stuff.
Absolutely. And we'll put the link to all of those on the show notes. Claire, it's been a pleasure. We're getting close to the end, though. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
So the easiest way to keep up with what I'm doing is to go to my Twitter account. And then from there, there are links to my Medium blog. So my Twitter account is at Clare Sudbery, and I'll spell that because it's not spelled the way anybody ever thinks it's going to be. So it's CLARE, no I, and then it's Sudbery is SUD for Delta, B for Bravo, ERY. That's the bit that catches people out. It's spelt the same way as surgery. So that's my Twitter account. And then, yeah, surgery and carvery. So just think of knives. But from my Twitter account, you can get to my Medium blog. And then on my Medium blog, there is a list of all the events that I'm involved in. So I'm speaking at Agile on the Beach in the UK and also at DevBreak in France. I'm not sure when this will be published, whether they will already happen, but they're happening in August and September.
Absolutely.
But my media blog always has my events on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put the link to those on the show notes. Make sure people can get in touch, and why not ask some questions from Clare? Clare, it's been a pleasure. So thank you very much for joining us here today and for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you very much.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.